In the spring of 1843, a girl vanished without a name. No notice was posted. No church bell rang. No grave was dug. Only a ledger entry, written in iron ink, marked her disappearance. Delivered. Female. Age 12. Sound. That line was recorded on the same day Baron Alistair H. Wickham celebrated his 15th wedding anniversary in the river town of Merriwick, Virginia. The Wickham estate stood on a hill above the town like a sermon carved from stone, columns white as bone, windows dark as confessionals. From its balconies, the Baron could see everything: the tobacco fields, the church steeple, the orphan house, the slave quarters, and the narrow road where wagons arrived and left lighter than they came. On that morning, a covered carriage passed through the iron gates without ceremony. No guests were invited. No servant spoke. Inside the carriage sat a child. She wore a dress too large for her body and shoes that had once belonged to someone else. Her hands were folded the way she'd been taught at the orphan ward, still, obedient, silent. She had learned long ago that silence kept you alive. When the carriage stopped, the driver did not help her down. He only said, "You belong here now." What no one in Merriwick knew, what the ledgers did not record, what the church would never speak aloud, was that the Baron was not giving his wife a servant. He was giving her a secret. And secrets, when buried inside families, rot differently than bodies. This is not a story about passion. It is not a story about scandal. It is a story about ownership, inheritance, and a child who was never meant to survive the truth. Alistair Wickham was not born cruel. That is what makes this story difficult. He was born into order. His father had been a judge. His grandfather, a church benefactor. The Wickham name was etched into pews, plaques, and probate records across 3 counties. They were not loud men. They were certain men. By the age of 30, Alistair owned land, people, and influence. By 40, he owned silence. The town of Merriwick depended on him. He funded the church roof. He paid the schoolteacher. He supplied the orphanage with grain and received, in return, children whose histories had been carefully erased. The Baron's wife, Eleanor Wickham, was admired from a distance. She dressed in mourning colors despite no recent loss. She spoke softly, as if the walls themselves were listening. After 15 years of marriage, she had no children. The town pitied her. What they did not know was that Eleanor had learned not to ask questions. Not after the 3rd locked room. Not after the servants who vanished. Not after the night she found blood on a child's ribbon and was told it came from a chicken. Power in Merriwick did not announce itself. It arranged things. And on that anniversary morning, Alistair Wickham arranged a gift that could never be acknowledged, because acknowledging it would collapse everything he controlled. Before she arrived at the estate, the girl had been known only as number 27. She was born somewhere between a river and a sin. No record named her mother. The father's name was omitted entirely, a common practice when omission protected men of standing. She had been raised first by a woman who disappeared, then by an institution that taught her scripture before language and obedience before identity. At the orphan house, children learned early that some were chosen. Chosen for farms. Chosen for labor. Chosen for houses with iron gates. Number 27 was chosen at 12. She was told to wash twice. To cut her hair. To forget what little she remembered. The matron kissed her forehead and whispered, "God has plans." But God did not sign the papers. The Baron did. When the girl was led into the Wickham house, she noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful, quiet, like a place holding its breath. Portraits lined the hall, men with identical eyes, women with expressions trained into stillness. One portrait stopped her, a young woman, painted years earlier. Dark eyes, the same curve of the mouth, the same birthmark near the ear. The girl reached up without thinking. A servant slapped her hand away. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you," he said. She did not yet know that the face in the painting was her mother, or that the man who stood at the end of the hall, watching her in silence, was her father. The anniversary dinner was served with 12 candles. One for each year Eleanor had waited. The girl stood against the wall, instructed not to speak unless spoken to. Eleanor studied her quietly, not with affection, but with calculation. This was a woman who had learned how to survive by observing. "She's small," Eleanor said. "She's young," the Baron replied. "She'll learn. Learn what was never said. Learn what was expected." The girl was introduced not as a daughter, not as kin, not even as a person, but as a solution. A presence meant to fill a silence Eleanor had carried for years. That night, the girl was shown to a narrow room near the east wing. The door locked from the outside. A Bible rested on the bed. Its pages were marked with verses about obedience, inheritance, and sin. Downstairs, the Baron poured wine. "To family," he said. Eleanor did not drink. She watched the candle flames flicker in. Dee wondered, not for the first time, how many truths a house could contain before it collapsed. And somewhere in the walls of the Whitcomb estate, something old and patient began to stir. Every Sunday, the bells of St. Bartholomew's rang with mechanical devotion. Their sound rolled over Merriwick like a command, not a call. The Whitcombs occupied the front pew, always had. The Baron sat straight-backed, gloved hands folded, eyes fixed forward as if God himself were a ledger to be balanced. Eleanor sat beside him, her spine rigid, her face composed into something that resembled reverence. The girl was brought weeks later. She was seated behind them, not among the servants, not among the congregation, in a place that suggested visibility without belonging. The Reverend Halsey noticed her immediately. He noticed the resemblance too. He had baptized too many unclaimed infants not to recognize the geometry of inherited faces. He had signed too many certificates that listed mothers, but not fathers. He had heard too many confessions that ended with donations large enough to quiet the soul. When the girl looked up at him, he flinched, not because she stared, but because she knew she was being watched. After the service, Eleanor lingered near the altar. The Reverend approached carefully, his voice low. "She's new to the household," he said. "Yes," Eleanor replied. There was a pause. In that pause lived every truth neither of them would name. "The Lord tests us in many forms," the Reverend finally said. Eleanor nodded. "And rewards discretion." That afternoon, the church ledger received a donation large enough to replace its cracked bell tower. And the girl learned her first lesson of Merriwick. God heard everything, but he did not intervene. The east wing of the Whitcomb estate was closed to guests. Its windows were shuttered, its carpets untouched by daylight. Servants avoided it unless ordered. Even then, they moved quickly, eyes lowered, as if the walls might remember faces. The girl was forbidden to enter. Naturally, that was where the truth lived. Late at night, she heard sounds, footsteps where no one should walk, doors opening that never opened during the day. Sometimes she heard a woman crying. Sometimes she heard nothing at all, which was worse. One afternoon, while dusting near the stairwell, she found a key. It had been hidden poorly, either by accident or intention. The lock resisted, then yielded. Inside, the air smelled of age and something sweeter, preserved flowers, perhaps, or rot masked by perfume. Portraits lined the walls. Dozens of them. All women. Different generations. Same eyes. Same posture. Same carefully neutral expression. At the end of the hall stood a single room. Inside it, a bed untouched by time. Dresses folded neatly. Letters stacked, but never opened. On the vanity sat a hand mirror. The girl lifted it. Her reflection stared back. Older now, thinner, but undeniably familiar. She understood then, without words. She did not scream. She did not cry. Children who grow up without protection learn quickly when sound becomes dangerous. She replaced the mirror and closed the door. Behind her, something in the house shifted, like a breath being taken after years of restraint. Eleanor Whitcomb had suspected for years. Not the details, but the shape of the lie. She had seen girls come and go. She had noticed how the Baron never looked at them in public, but never failed to notice them in private. She had learned to turn absence into survival. But the girl changed something. Because the resemblance was undeniable. One evening, Eleanor summoned the girl to her chamber. "You may sit," she said. The girl remained standing. Eleanor studied her carefully, not with cruelty, but with the cold attention of someone evaluating a structure for collapse. "How old are you?" Eleanor asked. 12, ma'am." "Do you know why you're here?" The girl hesitated. Then, softly, "To serve." Eleanor closed her eyes. In that moment, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would protect the lie, not because she believed in it, but because destroying it would destroy her. "You will do exactly as you are told," Eleanor said, "and you will never speak of what you think you know. If you do, you will not survive this house." The girl nodded. This was not a threat. It was instruction. Winter came early that year. Snow buried the fields. The river froze thick enough to carry wagons. The town slowed, insulated by cold and tradition. That was when the girl ran. She waited until dawn, when servants were distracted and the Baron was still asleep. She wore only a shawl and thin shoes. She did not take food. She did not take the Bible. She took the key. She ran toward the orphan house, toward the last place she had been allowed to exist as a child. But Merriwick was designed for containment. The road curved where it shouldn't. The trees thickened unnaturally. And before she reached the bridge, she heard hooves. The Baron did not shout. He did not run. He simply waited for her to stop. When he reached her, he took the key from her hand and studied her face, not with anger, but with something colder. "You cannot escape inheritance," he said. She was returned to the house before church bells rang. The next morning, the East Wing was unlocked, and the lessons became permanent. The Wickham estate did not punish loudly. It educated. After the failed escape, no chains were used. No bruises left where they could be seen. Instead, the house changed its behavior, as if it were alive and correcting an error. Doors that once opened now resisted. Hallways grew longer at night. Servants stopped meeting the girl's eyes entirely, as though she had already crossed into something contagious. She was moved into the East Wing, not as a prisoner, but as a fixture. The room she was given had once belonged to another girl. That much was clear. The walls carried faint scratches, almost polite in their desperation. On the dresser lay a brush with dark hair still tangled in its teeth. Each morning, Eleanor visited, not to comfort, but to instruct. How to walk, how to speak, how to lower your eyes when spoken to, and most importantly, how not to exist too much. The girl learned quickly, too quickly. She learned that the Baron never entered without knocking, that he never touched her in anger, that his cruelty lived not in violence, but in certainty, the certainty that she belonged to him, that her life was a correction to a mistake he had made years ago, and that mistakes were managed, not confessed. At night, she dreamed of the river calling her by a name she could not remember, and each morning, she woke knowing the house had listened. The discovery came by accident. Eleanor had sent the girl to retrieve a book from the study, one of the Baron's account volumes. They were kept locked, but Eleanor had learned long ago where keys were hidden. Inside the book, between property records and land deeds, the girl found something else. Names. Women's names. Children's names. Dates. Payments. Some names were crossed out. Some were underlined. Some were followed by a single word. Resolved. She turned pages with trembling hands. There were patterns. Girls born near Whitcomb properties. Mothers who disappeared shortly after childbirth. Children moved through orphan houses, then reassigned. And always, the Baron's signature. At the back of the ledger was a page left unfinished. A name written in careful script, then left blank. Her name. Not given, but anticipated. When Eleanor entered the room, she knew instantly what had been found. For a moment, the mask slipped. "That book," Eleanor said quietly, "is the spine of this house." The girl looked up. "What happens to the others?" Eleanor did not answer. She only took the ledger and locked it away again. That night, Eleanor burned letters in the fireplace until dawn. And for the first time in 15 years, she wept, not for the child, but for herself. Merriwick was not ignorant. It was practiced. People noticed when women vanished. They noticed when children arrived without stories. They noticed when the Whitcomb donations increased after funerals that never occurred. But Merriwick depended on forgetting. The mill relied on Whitcomb grain. The church relied on Whitcomb repairs. The orphan house relied on Whitcomb generosity. And so the town learned a discipline older than law. Selective memory. When the girl appeared in public again, older now, quieter, no one asked where she had come from. They only remarked on her resemblance to the portraits. Strong blood, they said. At the market, an old woman pressed a charm into her hand and whispered, "End it where it began." The girl did not yet understand, but she kept the charm. At night, she heard whispers through the walls. Not voices, but impressions. Regret soaked into wood. Confessions embedded in plaster. The house had been absorbing secrets for generations. And now it was full. On her 13th birthday, no one acknowledged the day. But something shifted. The Baron began bringing her to dinners, not as a servant, but as a presence. Guests noticed. Eleanor watched carefully. The church watched more carefully. It was not affection. It was preparation. The girl realized then what she had been made for. Not love. Not punishment. but continuation. That night, she returned to the east wing and opened the last door, one Eleanor had never entered. Inside, she found bones. Not piled, not hidden, arranged, each wrapped in cloth, each labeled with a name, each a woman, each a mother. She understood now. The Whitcomb legacy was not land. It was repetition, and she was not the first correction. She was simply the one who had lived long enough to see the pattern. She took the charm from her pocket and pressed it to her chest. For the first time, she made a promise, not to escape, but to remember. Eleanor Whitcomb had survived 15 years by refusing to see clearly. But clarity is not a thing you can postpone forever. It comes when the body is tired, when the mind has run out of bargains, when silence begins to feel heavier than truth. The night Eleanor learned what was in the final room of the East Wing, she did not scream. She sat. She sat on the floor beside the door until morning light cut through the shutters like a blade. The house creaked around her, adjusting, as it always did, to human collapse. When the Baron found her, she looked up and said only one sentence. She knows. For the first time in their marriage, the Baron hesitated. Not out of fear, out of calculation. She will be instructed, he replied. Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress. No, she said. She will be ended. The word hung between them. The Baron studied his wife, the woman who had protected his secrets longer than anyone else. You owe me, he said. I paid, Eleanor replied. With my body, with my name, with my soul. That night, Eleanor went to the church. St. Bartholomew's doors opened easily to Whitcomb hands. Inside, she confessed, not to sin, but to history. And the church listened the way it always had. Reverend Halsey did not interrupt Eleanor. He let her speak until her voice was gone. When she finished, he folded his hands and said, What you describe is complicated. That word again, complicated. As if horror became manageable when phrased correctly. If this truth becomes public, he continued, it will destroy more than one man. That is the point, Eleanor said. The Reverend sighed. And what of the girl? Eleanor answered without hesitation. She must live. The church deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th, Reverend Halsey delivered the verdict. There would be a fire, an accident. The East Wing would be destroyed. Records lost. Remains explained away as relics of an older estate burial. The girl would be sent north, to a distant household. Renamed, reassigned. The Baron would survive. So would the church. Eleanor laughed then, not loudly, but completely. You mistake me, she said. This is not a request. The Reverend looked at her for a long moment. And for the first time in his career, he felt something like fear. The fire began before dawn. It started where the walls were oldest, where secrets had been pressed longest into timber and bone. Servants ran. Bells rang. The town gathered. The Baron stood in the yard, watching. He did not order the fire put out. He knew what was burning. Inside the East Wing, Eleanor moved with purpose. She opened doors that had never been opened. She shattered locks. She dragged bones into the light. And the girl followed. Together, they carried the evidence of generations into the open air. When the roof collapsed, the sound was not violent. It was relieved. By morning, the East Wing was ash. And for the first time in its history, the Whitcomb estate was missing a piece of itself. The town whispered. The church prayed. And the Baron understood, too late, that his wife had chosen destruction over inheritance. The confession did not come in church. It came at the river. The Baron stood beside the girl as the water moved past them, dark and patient. You were never meant to last, he said calmly. I know, she replied. You were a solution, he continued. A correction. She looked at him then, not with hatred, but with clarity. You corrected nothing, she said. You multiplied it. The Baron smiled faintly. History is written by survivors. She stepped back, and for the first time, he reached for her, not in ownership, but in fear. But fear came too late. The river accepted him without resistance. The town would later say it was an accident. They always did. After the fire and the river, the girl vanished. This time, there were witnesses. They saw her leave Merriwick in a northbound carriage. They saw Eleanor press a bundle of papers into her hands. They saw the church seal stamped onto documents that renamed her into something safer, smaller, forgettable. A new name. A clean beginning. But disappearance is not erasure. Years later, whispers followed the roads. stories of a woman who worked quietly in record houses, who asked careful questions about missing girls, who knew how ledgers were written and how names were buried. She never stayed long. She understood now how places learned people. Merriwick marked her once. It would never mark her again. The Whitcomb estate was repaired, partially. The east wing remained sealed. Not rebuilt. Not explained. A choice framed as respect. The town told itself a story it could live with. A tragic fire. A grieving widow. A baron lost to the river. No mention of bones. No mention of ledgers. St. Bartholomew's replaced its bell tower. Reverend Halsey retired within the year, his sermons growing shorter, his eyes less certain. He was replaced by a younger man who asked fewer questions and accepted the town's version of memory. Merriwick survived. It always had. But something had shifted. Children stopped disappearing. Donations slowed. The town learned, without admitting it, that the system had been broken. And systems, once broken, never feel safe again. In 1912, a historian from Richmond arrived in Merriwick. He came looking for land records. He left with something else. In the courthouse basement, behind newer files, he found an old ledger, water-damaged, smoke-stained, but intact. Names filled its pages. Women, children, dates without explanations. And on the final page, a note written in a different hand. This record ends because it was witnessed. No signature. Only a pressed charm embedded between pages. The historian never published his findings. But copies of the names began appearing elsewhere, quietly, deliberately, as if someone had learned how truth spreads best when it does not announce itself. Today, the Whitcomb estate still stands. Visitors say it feels unfinished. The east wing remains closed. Not out of fear, but tradition. Locals will tell you it's just an old house with an unfortunate past. But they avoid walking near the river at night. And no one in Merriwick keeps ledgers anymore. Because some records do not stay closed. Some houses remember. And some children, once seen clearly, refuse to disappear again.